Hello there, Year 7. Welcome to your second piece of homework for this term. So, in your classes, you either have started already or you will be learning about the Vikings. Those people who came from Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, came over and changed England. You've been learning about that in class, and you will touch on the fact that Viking explorers actually made it in their longboats all the way over here to North America. In about the year 1000, a Viking by the name of Leif Erikson, um, Viking sagas record that he made it all the way over here to what's now Newfoundland in Canada, and a Viking settlement which they called Vinland, and nowadays is a place called L'Anse aux Meadows, was set up. But the Viking settlement there didn't last very long. Eventually the Viking settlers were chased away by people who they described in their written stories called sagas as Skraelings. But who were those people? They must have been the indigenous people who already lived in America. Indigenous means the people who already or who originally come from a certain part of the world. And for your homework this term, you're going to be looking at the indigenous Americans. So what did America look like, the land that's now occupied by the United States and Canada? What did North America look like in around about 1000 AD? So the Vikings arrived there, then they left. Who was living there? Well, the answer is a lot of different people. Well, first of all, a lot of people. Some historians think maybe up to 400,000 people were living in the continent at that time. Huge number. And there was a huge amount of diversity within the continent, loads of different groups of people. So what you're going to be doing for your project this term is creating a map of North America, and there's an example here on the website for you to have a look at, but you're going to be adding detail about sort of the main groups of people who lived in North America about 1,000 years ago. So the first thing that we need to understand is something that bound a lot of people together from the southwest down to the south all the way up to the northeast was agriculture, farming. And indigenous Americans across huge parts of the continent had developed a very successful form of agriculture. Different to the plants that were growing on this side of the world. You can see that Americas are separated from Asia, Europe and Africa by the Atlantic Ocean. So different plants had evolved in this part of the world to in this part of the world. And that's something that's going to be really important, as you'll see later on in Year 8 when we learn about how those two worlds collided and exchanged the different plants that have been growing. But the three main crops grown in North America, they were so central to indigenous American life, Native American life, they were known as the Three Sisters, and they were these. Firstly, beans. There's some I grow on my allotment. Squash and corn, or sweet corn. There's a slightly dried out piece of sweet corn here, but you all know what sweet corn looks like, right? There we go. Now, what made these three crops work so well together, that they were called the Three Sisters? Well, they all grow symbiotically, so they look after each other when they grow. If anyone's ever seen sweet corn growing, it grows in huge, great stalks, and beans need a stalk to grow on. Usually on the allotment I put like a stick in the ground and the beans will grow up that stick. But if you plant corn, then the beans can grow up the stalk of the corn. So they've got something to hold on to, the vines that the beans grow on. And then squash, they grow kind of flat out along the ground with big leaves that prevent too much sunlight from getting on the ground. So what that did was it stopped too many weeds from growing and killing the other plants. Now, beans also contain a lot of nitrogen, which is great for the soil for the other plants to grow in. So the three crops complement each other perfectly when you're growing them. They all work together perfectly. And more than that, if you eat a diet of beans and squash and corn, you're eating a perfectly balanced diet, because beans have got a lot of protein in. They're really, really good for you. The three foods together give you lots of complex carbohydrates, all 9 of the amino acids that you need in your diet, and they've got some really healthy fatty acids in them as well. So basically, they're really, really good for you. If you eat a lot of corn, squash and beans, you're going to be pretty healthy. And so the people in all of these parts of North America, they had a healthy diet, and they knew how to eat properly and to eat a balanced diet. You learned right at the start of Year 7 how farming developed over here with wheat, and in China with rice. Well, it also developed independently in what's now Mexico, where people started to develop corn, and then that idea spread to the north, just as the idea of farming had spread to what's called sometimes the Old World. That's Asia and Europe. Right. So you need to know now about the different groups of people that lived in North America. So we'll start down here with the along the River Mississippi, the Mississippian culture. That's what modern archaeologists call the people, describe the culture that existed down here about 1000 AD. And the people here lived in towns, sometimes really big towns. There was a town near the modern-day city of St. Louis called Cahokia, which was estimated in about 1000 AD to have nearly 20,000 people living in it. That would have made it bigger than London at that time. This was a huge town. The people who lived there, they constructed these huge man-made mounds. Sometimes they were just in the shape of a hill, but sometimes they were in the shape of animals like alligators or snakes or birds. And these towns would have been surrounded by fields of corn and beans and squash, and temples were built on top of the mounds to the gods of farming. So these were huge and advanced cities that existed in this part of the world. If we move over to the southwest, what are the present day areas of Arizona and New Mexico, there were cultures living there, including the Anasazi people. They lived in multi-story buildings. They constructed dams to hold water. Water's quite scarce in that part of the world. They built 400 miles of roads, and they had trade links with the civilizations in what is now Mexico, such as, well, the Aztecs weren't really around in 1000 AD, but the groups of people who would later become the Aztecs. Then if we move up to the northeast, so these are the sorts of people who would have contacted the Vikings when they came over to North America. Here, people lived in villages. They were also farmers, using the Three Sisters method. There was a lot of warfare up here, so there were sort of nations made up of groups of villages who would quite often fight each other. And so the people who lived up here were fearsome warriors often. But it was the women, the clan mothers, who kind of did all of the a lot of the diplomacy and the running of these villages in the northeast. Then we look up here in the northwest, the plains area. This is where, if you've ever, I don't know if people still watch Western films, but if you've ever seen a sort of cowboys and Indians film, these are the sorts of indigenous Americans you probably think of. Although, of course, we have to remember at this time they wouldn't have had any horses, as they do in films about a later period. The horses were brought over much later by Europeans. So here people, they didn't have farming, or they didn't use farming. They were nomads, so they moved around from place to place and hunted bison, huge mammals roaming around on those plains up there. And then if we move right up to the far north, we've got the Arctic people the ancestors of what became known as the Inuit people who survived from hunting whales. So, what you need to do for your homework is, there's a map here on the website. Just look down at the bottom, you'll see it. You need to create your own version of this map with all the different groups of indigenous people that we've just learnt about on there. Add some detail to it about who they were, what made them different from each other, how did they survive, all of the details that I've given you. It's also written down underneath. And you also need to include the areas where the Three Sisters method of farming was used, and add some detail about that. Make this work look really good, as though it could be put on display. And then, having learnt about the people in the northeast here, think about why the Viking settlement that started off here in the corner of North America, why did that fail? Why did the Vikings get chased away? And what does that tell us about the indigenous people here in the northeast? That's your work for this term. Good luck.